Hello, everybody. Welcome to a new episode of the Dissenter. I'm your host, as always, Ricardo Lopes, and today I'm joined by Dr. Thibaud Gruber. He is assistant professor of psychology at the University of Geneva, and he is also part of the Swiss Center for Affective Sciences. Working with chimps, orangutans, and bonobos, he is interested in the evolutionary origins of culture and language, and today we're going to talk about those subjects and also tool making and tool use. So, Dr. Gruber, thank you a lot for taking the time to come on the show. It's a pleasure to have you on.
Hello, thank you for having me.
Okay, great. So, you study the behavior of chimps, orangutans, bonobos. Is there any other primate that you also study or not?
Yeah, I mean, recently I've been working with baboons as well, and we also have a population of Ugandan Mangabe in the new field site where I'm working, so we're trying to extend there. And I'm also, I've been working with humans, especially like human children for the last 5, 6 years. So.
Mhm. Yeah, that's very interesting. And let me just ask you, since you work with orangutans, and orangutans, I think, split from our evolutionary branch, I guess, earlier than chimps and bonobos. So, by including orangutans, are you also trying to understand what are the phylogenetic bases of some of the behaviors that you're going to talk about? That is basically the evolutionary steps that it took for us to evolve certain cognitive mechanisms, or?
I mean, the reason why I started with orangutans was because, I mean, I spent all my PhD, so I spent my master's degree working with bonobos, then I did my PhD with wild chimpanzees, and what we found with the kind of experiments we had, uh, and it was between like very nearby communities, there was something we could actually also translocate quite easily with orangutans, at least we thought, and this is why I got in touch with Karl van Schaik, who's world expert in orangutans, and then we went like this. So the idea was more because we know that there are some orangutans that use tools and others that use less tools. So it was really like a mirror of what I've been doing with chimps. And that's actually the reason why I went for orangutans. And obviously, as you said, there is also this distance that also can indicate what was actually common to orangutans, to all the last ancestor of orangutans and other chimp and humans. So that's also there that we can also get another image. Like let's say we de-zoom a bit from just the hominines, basically.
Hmm. Yeah, and chimps, bonobos, and orangutans, all of them use tools, correct?
They all use tools, but at different rates. For example, bonobos are quite famous for not using that many tools in the wild. But my first study with them was in captivity and in San Diego. And together with Zana Clay, we recorded all this tool behavior we could see in several zoos, also in Europe, and we could see, well, look at it. There's not much difference with chimps. Yet, if you go to the wild, they really don't use that many tools. But that's actually also valid for the community I studied during my PhD of wild eastern chimpanzees in Budongo. They are quite famous for not using that many tools, or at least at the time, 10 years back. So in 2009, when I started my PhD, that was the state of knowledge.
Mhm. And that's very interesting because if there's a difference in how they use tools from, let's say, a lab to a natural environment, what does that tell us uh, about them? I mean, because does it tell us that they have cognitive capacities that they don't employ in a natural environment, or since they use more tools in an artificial setting, or what exactly?
I mean, there are many things. I mean, so for once, yes, we do have the cognitive capacities. That's not that they are not using them. They probably use them for something else. So the one thing is, for tool use, there are a lot of capacities that are being used that are not specific to tool use. So if you think about planning or sequence or things like that, this is something that they can actually use for other things. In the wild, we can assume, I mean, right now we still don't exactly know what's happening in terms of what triggers tool use. So we talk about, for example, the opportunities that they have to use tools or the necessity to use them. And this is still not, there's still a debate out there to know really what is the most important factor in triggering tool use. I mean, full disclaimer, for me, that's pretty much a bit of both. And I think they are just sometimes you have a bit more of opportunity, sometimes you have more of necessity. That really depends on the time. And you could imagine that a zoo setting or a captivity setting is also addressing some of these. So, for example, you don't have necessarily the necessity to find food because you're going to get fed every day. And at the same time, you also can have a lot of opportunities because you're, especially now in recent time, zoos really try to bring a lot of enrichment to the chimps. So it's great if the visitors can see chimps using a stick to get honey or stuff like that. And so these are all the things you have to think about. Like a chimp in captivity is still a chimp, but they have a very different upbringing, a very different motivations, and very different opportunities to do a lot of things that a wild chimp was basically every day waking up thinking, oh, I need to find my food, or I need to be social, and so on. It's a very different set of mind, so to speak.
Mm-hmm. So we have to be a little bit careful when trying to extrapolate the results we get from experiments done in captivity to natural environments, right?
I think it's, you have to just know what you're working with, basically. So for me, we see a lot of fancy results coming from chimps that have been, doing a lot of cognitive experiments. But these guys have so much knowledge of these experiments and so much, if you just change a little thing there, well, obviously they're not stupid. They're going to translate their knowledge from one thing to the other one. If you take the Dongo chimps whom I've been working with, they've never used sticks in their lives. So if you ask them to use sticks, they look like they're completely, unaware that a stick can actually be used as a tool. And this shows you that you really have to take into account the history, or what I usually call the cultural knowledge of a given community in order to make any claim. That's more the thing. So, it's not like, it's useless to disparage experiments in captivity because they do teach us a lot as well. And I've really tried in my work to actually combine observation in zoos or in sanctuaries with observation in the wild, because I do believe all of them can actually bring something to us.
Mm-hmm. And you mentioned cultural knowledge of a particular community. So in their communities in the wild, do they transmit tool making knowledge among themselves?
Well, we actually got a really great example nearly 10 years ago now, which is called moss sponging. So chimps are very famous for some tool use. One of the most common tool use actually is very much unheard of by public audiences, like leaf sponge making. And that's something they actually use to get water. So they basically put waters in their mouth, they roll them into into a sponge, and then they use it to drink. And this is actually present in every community so far, apart from a couple of them. So we know that it's very much widespread between chimpanzee communities. But what we actually observed about 10 years ago is that our chimps in the Dongo started using moss to do the same thing. And finally, if you look at it, the tools like a leaf sponge and a moss sponge, they are very different. And somehow the moss sponge actually looks even like easier to make, because it's just like, taking a bunch of moss in your mouth and then just rolling it into a little bowl, and then it gets the water. But this was the first time we could observe that, and we could actually record the transmission of this behavior throughout the community. And it started with the alpha male and the alpha female, and then it spread to a few other more individuals. We had a total of 8 individuals, I think, if I remember well. And what was interesting is when we continued observing this behavior, also through field experiments, where we were trying to look at what kind of tool they would actually manufacture, we could see that there was a direct transmission within the family lines. So this was actually one of the few evidence of social learning and social transmission in wild chimpanzees.
So there's transmission within family lines. Does that mean that that transmission of knowledge or cultural knowledge is skin-based?
Well, that's one hypothesis. So the point is, our data are really consistent with this, like at least regarding moss sponge. So that doesn't exclude that there is also some kind of horizontal transmission, which means during the same generation, like kids will play together and they can learn something from each other. So the point is, you have to understand that chimps most of the time spend most of their young life, so really with a very small core, which is basically their mom, their brothers and sisters, and that's it. And the associate of their moms. So that's the kind of individuals you can actually learn from. And that was actually quite beautiful to see that in the data that moss sponge over the course of 3 years really mostly spread into the family lines, but did not spread according to who you were associating with, outside of your families. So it was interesting to see. So yes, that's one clear part of a transmission, and I would note that's also something that's observed with other species such as dolphins. The dolphin tool use, sponge tool use, actually is also transmitted through family lines and mature lines, actually.
And these behaviors that they exhibit, they have to be learned from others. I mean, or is there some innate aspect to them? Would it be the case that if they didn't learn them from others, they would eventually exhibit them the same?
Well, I think, the debate is still out there. I mean, to me, the word of innate is always a problem. So in our community, we tend always to look at it for, it's like innate instinct and so on. We don't like to talk so much about that. But I mean, there are definitely predispositions the same way that human children or human babies, they want to grab stuff and so on. And actually, you can observe the same thing in chimpanzees and bonobos. The one thing that's necessary, I think, is that you need a model. You need somehow someone to show you something, and that was actually really the heart of my experiment in the Dongo, because to these chimps. So, for example, Mike Tomasello said that chimps would just learn if they were seeing their mother or like just the wind roll a leaf. And there were experiments already in captivity that showed that, well, if they only see like this ghost condition where it's basically made in front of them, but without a model, they don't really succeed. But here, what I wanted to do is, if I literally plug a stick inside a pot of honey, and that the hole is too small that you can put your fingers, the only way you can actually get the honey will be to use the stick, and you will see just the chimps taking the stick out, licking the honey, and then just dropping the stick. So that tells you that this does not trigger any behavior, especially in the wild settings.
That's very interesting. And in terms of the tools that the primates that you study use, do they look for particular traits or properties that each material that they use have to obtain the particular thing that they want from it?
Well, we did show actually one interesting thing about the spread of this moss sponging behavior, so that we think it's actually also connected to chimps being able to assess what is the most convenient, most efficient tool. So, for example, the moss sponges are able to get more water than leaf sponges, and they're also just faster to manufacture. So overall, basically, you can actually make a faster tool, and it's actually getting more water for you. So our experiments really suggest that when you have that knowledge, that they know the two material, they are going to go for the most efficient one. But this is also culturally dependent, as I said. If you don't have experience with moss, then you will just go with the usual leaf sponge because you have been doing leaf sponge all your life.
And the ones, I mean, if, for example, some minutes ago you talked about the alpha male and the alpha female using new tools and then vertical transmission of those tools to other chimps, for example. How do they come up with new tools? Is that it's by trial and error or something else?
I mean, this remains, I mean, right now still a mystery. I mean, we have a few ideas, but we still need to investigate. But, you know, Nick, for example, never seemed to be the brightest guy, you know, in the group. So you were like, why is he going to do that at this moment? So, you know, we never claimed that he was the original innovator. We always said, you know, can be careful. That's the first time it's recorded. Before that, it wasn't recorded, but, you know, that's the why we cannot exclude that he actually learned from someone else, for example, in his family or something like that. So it's really hard to think. And for example, we also have a case of one of our female learning potentially by picking up a leaf sponge, a moss sponge on the ground. So basically, she knows how to make leaf sponge. She knows this thing. Oh, that's material that seems to be, you know, material that works to make a leaf moss sponge or a sponge in general. And I just make my sponge, and then she makes actually a mix of both. So that's also something that can happen. That, you know, you just integrate a bit of new things in your already existing knowledge, and then you know, when you have enough moss, then you just realize, oh, I don't need to bother trying to make a complicated tool because this works much better.
And is there a basic set of cognitive mechanisms that we know, or at least a minimum set that a particular species has to have in order to be able to to create tools and to use them? Because I would imagine that from an evolutionary perspective or a biological perspective, it would be a little bit complicated for animals to associate a particular tool to a particular action and to obtaining a particular thing. So they have to have probably a minimum set of cognitive traits to be able to do that.
I think the question is out there because, you know, I think in terms of animal tool use, we really need to distinguish two types. And, you know, there is this famous example of Egyptian vultures that's been actually described by Jane Goodall. And they just, you know, they just like drop stones onto eggs, which break them, and they can eat from them. And this is just one type of tool use in one particular context. And that's it. They're not going, you know, you're not going to see them using tools in a different context. That's very different from an orangutan or a chimp who are using tools in a broad range of contexts, whether it's like social, whether it's getting food, or it's like in the mating context and so on. So Joseph Cole is actually was a psychologist in St. Andrews, described this idea of like creative tool users, which I think is quite correct in terms of, you know, to be a creative tool user is much harder than to be a tool user. And to be this creative tool user, you need indeed to have this kind of mental flexibility. And this is something we still do not really know how, you know, it works. So, for example, I'm very interested in terms of representations. So in terms of mental representation, or, you know, you connect the dots and so on, you think, oh, I can use that tool to collect this kind of substrate. And this is something we really have not much understanding yet across species.
So we are not sure if they need to mentally represent for example, the sequence of actions that they have to do or not. Is that it?
Well, that can be about the sequence. It just can be about, in general, the choice that they have to make. So to me, for example, I'm arguing that if chimpanzee in the head, they can, you know, have this choice between moss and leaves to make a sponge, and that they actually can think, oh, well, I'm going to go with moss because moss is more efficient. Then you're really talking about something that's very, very close to what we humans do, because, you know, we are like thinking, oh, I have this spoon and I have these chopsticks. What is going to be the easiest for me in the restaurant? If I'm, you know, I don't know if I want to not look like I don't know how to use chopsticks or something like that. All these things in your head that you can think about that are completely going to impact on what kind of choice you're going to make at the end. So I'm not saying chimps are thinking, oh, am I going to look like if I just cannot make a moss sponge? But what I'm saying is, at least if there's this kind of mental capacity to think about what kind of tool they're going to use, that's already very different than something that's completely automatic, where we just step in front of water. They're like, oh, I'm going to make, it's not even thinking, they just directly make a sponge because they have associated water with sponges, which I think does not work with what we see in the wild.
Mhm. And is there any way for us to learn if they really have those sorts of mental representations and if they are in any way conscious or not? I mean, if they are really thinking, okay, so now I'm going to pick up this stone, am I going to smash that thing for me to obtain food, and so on and so forth?
I mean, that's where we're really getting into very complicated paradigms, or at least theoretically they are more complicated because we try to ask things about their minds rather than their behavior. So last year we published a study where we were really trying to do that. This time it was with captive chimps, but also with a comparison of children. So the idea was to demonstrate, so have a demonstrator, human demonstrator, using some object as tools and others not as tools. So basically as objects. So you have this dichotomy, an object is used to have an action on something, so it was the idea of opening a box, and the others you would just put them in contact with them. And the idea then is we do some kind of matching to sample paradigm. So basically matching to sample paradigm is I'm showing you something, for example, on a tray, then I'm showing you this thing again with something different, and then you will go for the thing that I've just showed you. But we could actually change it into something that we call matching to function. And instead of, so we would present one tool, for example, and then we present another tool and a non-tool. And you would imagine that if you have understood that there is a similarity between the non-tools in terms of function, you will select a non-tool if your probe is a non-tool, or a tool if what has been presented is a tool. And what we actually showed is that this is actually really complex for even children to do. So our results on 7, we only had one child who was 7 who actually could do that. But if you compare with the chimps we tested, most chimps did not actually even reach a stage where they could make the choice. But one chimp, who is called I, and I think I is quite famous as a chimpanzee, had results that were basically matching the ones of 8-year-old children. So, it tells you, well, I have one chimp, but who does it? What does it tell me? Is it that they have a capacity? Or is it just luck? Probably not, because she was above chance level. But what's going on in her mind? So the only thing it tells you is, oh, I need to get just more experience and more experiments, with other chimps to see in general if they have this kind of cognitive flexibility and this idea of, sorting things together.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and are chimps or the other primates that you study able to evolve their tools over time? I mean, over the generations, for example?
Well, this has been one of the biggest debate at the moment. So I would say 20 years ago, the big debate was whether animal had culture. Now the big debate in 2020 or even before, for the last 10 years, has been do animals exhibit what we call cumulative culture? So the question is whether they can build upon their knowledge and make it more efficient, more complex, and so on. So the problem I have all the time with this is that it seems we always put very weird, very hard criteria to meet just to make sure cumulative culture stays very much human. And so, for example, some people were saying, well, cumulative culture, you need to have traits that, as you say, evolve to be more efficient or more complex. Now, most sponges are more efficient and they are socially transmitted and they build on existing knowledge. So I'm going to these people, I tell them, well, you see, this should be cumulative culture, right? They're like, well, maybe it's not just efficient, it has to be complex. And then you're like, well, that doesn't make sense because much of our cultures sometimes they evolve towards more complexity, but they sometimes actually evolve towards something less complex. So to me, it doesn't make sense, but very much defining criteria. Beyond should be it actually builds on something that already exists and it spreads socially. In that case, we can argue that some behavior in chimpanzee and some other species, for example, New Caledonian crows, can correspond to some kind of cumulative culture. That doesn't mean we are like them or like they are like us. I mean, they only have a few cases where their behavior actually evolved. And we are obviously like, champions of evolving our cultures, but nobody's going to contest that. My main problem is that you're just denying just plain and simple from other animals. When did it actually happen in our own evolution? That's really my question. To me, Eric, an individual like Homo habilis or Australopithecus habilis, as we call it now, have the same brain as a chimp. So there is like really quality jumps at several times in history, like Erectus and so on and so on. But the point is, how did these guys think? And for me, looking at chimps really helped me to try to think, well, their lives were different. They had different environments, but not so different, because we think our ancestors really lived in these woodland areas. It's not really much anymore this savanna story. So now it's more about, well, these guys were just, walking at the edge of the forest, and sometimes they would, be confronted to opportunities to use tools and so on. So to me, the idea that, cumulative culture can just have magically appeared, well, obviously people have arguments, it's not like magical, we're connected to language and so on, and imitation. But the fact that it would have just appeared like, 400,000 years ago, doesn't make sense. To me, it needs to have some kind of preparatory, biological background. And I think, we're not asking much by saying, well, look, chimps and some other species actually are able to evolve, to have, to change their tools and to build upon their knowledge. Not much. They're not that, they're not good at it, but it still exists. And that's a very different point than saying it just doesn't exist anywhere else than in modern humans.
Mm-hmm. Yes, that's very interesting. And since you study orangutan, chimps, and bonobos and other primates that you mentioned, but do you see any progression from an evolutionary perspective, for example, from orangutans to chimps, bonobos, and then humans in terms of the cognitive mechanisms that they exhibit, for example, in tool making? I mean, are chimps and bonobos really closer to humans than orangutans or not?
I would say no. I don't think so. I mean, there are like differences. I mean, in a way, you might always argue that chimpanzees are really close to humans in many respects. Like, so it's, in terms of tool use, in terms of vocalizations, more than the other ape species. But and a lot of people tend to basically pull together these species. And then they just make a general claim about apes. And I don't think that's correct, because I think, an orangutan thinks very differently than a bonobo and a chimpanzee. Like, for example, bonobos are very famous for being very social. I mean, they're more interested in interacting with you than interacting with the object you're presenting to them. That already makes a very big difference. The chimp is more interested in getting the food that you're going to give him than actually interacting with you. So it's, I mean, obviously it's like a caricature, but depends on the individual. But the point of saying, well, a chimp is better tool user than an orangutan. I mean, the question is out there, like the orangutans in Swat, for example, Swat Balimbing, which is in Sumatra, they're really good tool users. They're better tool users than the Bidongo chimps of Uganda. So I think it's really looking more at the individuals, and we have also a lot of tool use in macaques, so in the long-tailed macaques, and they do really cool stuff as well. So the main questions now is more: is it like this kind of primate tool use that's different from other tool use? I mean, we can always have the example of crows that are extremely interesting in their tool use too. So to me, it's not a competition between the species. It's just how they adapted to their ecological niche and how they can explain to us also how our own tool use evolved.
Mhm. Yeah, and I mean, I've already asked you about cognitive mechanisms. Is there a social organization, a particular kind of social organization that the species has to have to be able to create tools and to have culture? Because, I mean, the societies of orangutans and chimps and bonobos are different from one another, but they still are able to all of them create tools. So.
Yeah, I mean that's a very good point. I mean, what's interesting is actually the orangutans really show you that you don't need to be that social to have an extended culture, and that's really owing to the fact that their cultural transmission is mostly vertical. So they are very social, but with a very few individuals. On the other hand, you have like groups of like troops of bonobos that are very cohesive, like, and they don't learn much from each other. But that's always owning to me. I mean, sorry, they don't learn much in terms of tool use. They learn other things, but I think it's really because they don't have a model tool use to them. Because at a certain point, uh, we don't know actually. We there is some possibility that the common ancestor of bonobos and chimps and humans use tools. That's really, I would say, the hypothesis zero, like that people would tend to agree upon. So it's more that bonobos really dropped most of their tool use because they didn't need that anymore. That's something that, and a hypothesis that I defend, especially based on my work with this so-called tool-less chimpanzees in Uganda. But I do think, the society is one thing, whatever society they have now. It all started from a common ancestor that had a kind of society that we don't know about. So we can make guesses. We can say that it was multi-male, multi-female. What's interesting is, the social weight of either males or females is different in chimps, in bonobos, and also in humans. So, the idea is like, and it's also very different, obviously, from orangutans. But in that case, if you just stick to chimp humans and bonobos, we have like different faces of the same coin in a way. So all of that, was very useful. We can think also that we have like the young females are switching communities at adolescence. So do they actually bring any knowledge with them? And does it make it easier if you're in a community where, you don't start just right at the bottom of the scale, because nobody's going to look at you. And they have this very interesting observation in chimps with this female Yo in Bosu, who immigrated to Bosu. And then the researcher were presenting nuts that were not found in Bosu, but were probably found in the areas she came from. And then, like 20 years later, she was just, oh yeah, cool, I can actually, crack these nuts, while the other one had never seen that. And interestingly, the only one who actually paid attention were the young juveniles around her. So that tells you, an individual can basically bring new knowledge into a community, although most of the time what we see is that actually the new individual is more likely to conform to the current trend in the community, and that's not just seen in apes, but Erika Vandela, for example, in Lausanne, has really beautiful examples with vervets going into a community and basically following the trend.
Mhm. Yeah. So I've been asking you about tool making and tool use, but you've also studied vocalization. So could you tell us about that? In what primates did you study vocalizations, and in what contexts do they use them?
Okay, so originally, when I started working with animals, I worked with vocalization in birds. So the reason why I actually started my PhD was I didn't really know what kind of topic I was going to do. But when we came up with this idea of doing like field experiment, my PhD advisor was Professor Klaus Zuber-Buller, was saying, well, field experiments are really hard to conduct, so you need to have like a backup plan, something that could actually make you a PhD. And at that time, we was very interested in looking at this low intensity vocalization in chimpanzee that are called who. And so I did really this study about who calls in chimpanzees, in particular who's that are produced during travel. And what we actually showed was that chimpanzee would produce these calls in a certain context to recruit other individuals. So to me, it was very interesting because it showed that this idea that vocalization would just be purely emotional just didn't make sense. Here there was like some real meaning. You basically also send this vocalization for certain individuals, and that leads you to recruit them to travel with you. So that was a bit the start of my interest in vocalizations, which I also tied to human properties of language, for example, intentional communication. And interestingly, now that I've moved into an emotion center, I'm getting back to the idea of emotion, but and with this idea that there is no strong dichotomy between emotion and intentional communication. So, you know, emotion is part of intentional communication, and this is up to us to, you know, stop this very, I would say, convenient and very easy dichotomy of saying, well, you know, all ape vocalization are just emotions, and we humans with language, we have all the meaningful stuff. It's just way too easy, and that's just not true. So that's really what I'm really interested in at the moment, is really integrating these different threads, especially all these emotional things that we tend to either dismiss because, oh, you see, it's emotional, or, you know, then you use it as just, well, it's all but humans, it's all emotion, and we are the most complex cognitive being in the planet.
So, two questions about that. The first one is, do we know if other primates also have intentional communication?
They have intentional production, surely. The question is, so the idea is, what's really complex there is that there's this philosophical notion, obviously, of intentionality, and also this approach to intentional communication. And this can be quite complex because it's not simply me being, you know, producing something with the aim of you making something, which is this goal-oriented approach to intentional communication, is a very big simplification of what people usually think about when we talk about intentional communication. Intentional communication, it also includes the fact that I want you to make something, for at least for animals, let's say, but I also want to signify to you that I want to engage in communication with you. And that's also something that you understand, and you also want to engage in communication with me. This is what really goes on into intentional communication. And this is the part where we have a problem with apes or any other animal, really. It's like, you know, this display of I want to communicate with you is what is still escaping at the moment from research. So with a lot of folks, we published a paper that's cited a lot these days about, you know, showing what kind of minimal criteria you would need for intentional communication in animals. But this paper still is, you know, only gives you a few bases, but a lot of people tell, well, whatever criterion you've put there, it doesn't describe intentional communication with what we do in humans. So the big thing here is really to think about how to go as close as possible. You know, it might be that really, you know, we're the only species that really wants to engage into communication, but we're getting more and more, you know, indications or evidence from different species that there is this kind of interactive game that goes on, and which is really part of intentional communication.
And you mentioned emotions, and you mentioned that recently you went back to studying emotions and how they interrelate, for example, with intentional communication. Do they also play an important role in cultural learning?
Well, that's like the 1 million question at the moment. So I do think it's very important. And in fact, I would say I think it's very weird that we really, as scientists, haven't really considered that. So a few years ago, we actually had a meeting organized in Neuchâtel by some people belonging to the Swiss Center for Affective Science, so Daniel Duke and Fabrice Clément, and they invited a lot of people to give different what they actually understood with the idea of what they call affective social learning. And that's this idea that you actually not only, you learn the value of something or an attitude or going somewhere, if I say, oh, it was really great, I went to the Alps last weekend, it was absolutely beautiful, I enjoyed it so much. I'm giving you information about that place, and I kind of really advise you to go because you see that I'm very excited about it. And all of that basically is pretty much never discussed. And then Danny Duke and Fabrice Clément asked me and a few others to see, well, you have this thing in humans that we are describing. What do you think happens in chimpanzees and other apes? And I was like, that's very interesting, because this is probably, if we keep describing other animals as just emotional beasts, then you're like, well, we should look at this emotional side. And in fact, if a mother at a certain point, she wants to be using a stick to get honey, and then she got super scared, and you're like the small juvenile next to her, but you're not going to learn anything. You're just going to see your mom freaking out, and you also probably are going to freak out, and you're not going to learn anything, which I would say is also something happening in human children. Learning happens in a particular context, and this is really what I'm really interested at the moment, looking at this variation in terms of what's your social environment in the sense of your emotional environment, how does it impact learning. And I think this is really a key to understanding continuity among species, because we can't argue on the one hand that animals are just emotional all the time when it's convenient, and then when it's about culture, first of all, many people don't think they have culture. But I do think this idea of emotion and emotional learning can really connect learning, like cultural learning in humans and cultural learning in other animals, particularly great apes.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And is there any relationship between behavioral flexibility and culture? I mean, is it that animals, whatever species we're talking about, need at least to have some behavioral flexibility to be able to also have culture, or not?
I would say it is, again, something you can take as a clue, as evidence, but it's not necessary. In other words, you could very much imagine if you're like an outside observer, and you could imagine that every individual in the community develops a particular behavior in response to some trigger, and they all have that. And in a different community, they have a different behavior that also depends on a particular trigger. And you could actually, as an outsider, you would just arrive there and say, oh, these guys are displaying this, they all do that, and the other guys do all of it the same way. And, there is absolutely no way to distinguish between this and individuals who have been just copying each other before you arrived. Mm-hmm. So the point here is to say it's still very complex to estimate, what actually is necessary for cultural behavior to emerge, because there's also going into what is social learning, what is culture. And to me, I try to put that point about culture being this idea of representing it. So here you can imagine that if you can think about what you know, and that's here you're getting into these very complex processes that we call metacognition and so on, and meta-representation. If you can really have an idea of what you know and what the other know, then you're starting to get in more what we could call culture. But I like to think that, chimps, we still have to evaluate whether they would know that knowledge is different from another community, but the most likely thing that's going to happen is that if chimps are seeing like another group, they're just going to kill each other. While bonobos, they would not. The sad thing is obviously bonobos are not using that many tools, so it's harder to test or to observe. But the idea there is like one day in our evolution, some guy just realized, oh, you're doing like me, but these guys don't do like me. And that's a bit the idea of, this birth of the notion of culture. So as I say, you can really have this really wide spectrum that goes from having anything, just behavior being copied or being passed on or being triggered that really characterize a particular community. That's already culture in a way. to the idea of like thinking about what's right and wrong, what's moral in my community, what's not in yours, and you're different from me, and so on and so on. And these are all like just whole spectrum.
And do we know what are the sorts of evolutionary pressures that a particular species has to be exposed to in order for it to evolve culture? I'm asking you this because I've had on the show people that do work on cultural evolution, like Dr. Robert Boyd, and he has an hypothesis that we as humans evolved this very complex culture that we have, and cumulative culture, because during the Pleistocene there were a lot of environmental fluctuations, and so we were exposed to different circumstances. I mean, we had to resort to different food sources and create different technology to be able to survive and things like that. And so I was wondering if these factors, specifically environmental fluctuations, is something that a species has to go through to develop culture or not?
I mean, that's something that's very interesting, especially concerning the, let's say, the ecological debate on culture in animals, because many people, for example, 20 years ago, when there was this very influential paper by Andy Whiten and collaborators on cultures in chimpanzees, they were saying, well, you know, we can control for ecological variation, genetic variation, and then if there is still variation, that should be culture. And people were not very happy with that, and they say, well, you didn't really look correctly at ecology. And I would say 20 years later, I think people have kind of integrated that you can have ecological variation and that it has an impact, and it has to be computed along with social learning variation. So to come back to the position that's been described for humans, I do think that it is very valid to put ecological triggers, and you know, some kind of catastrophe can happen, and then half of your whole food is depleted, and you have to find a new strategy, because if not, you're starving and dying. And what's interesting is what happened in the community where I did my PhD is probably the reverse. So because there was actually in Bedongo was the largest sawmill in African rainforest, that basically, you know, we use all this wood from mahogany and other very precious species that they send directly to London. And what's interesting is that they also planted new species, for example, peppermill tree that actually produce very nice fruits that chimps started to consume. And then, you know, to me, they got like new opportunities, new feeding opportunities that really pretty much made tool use irrelevant, because, you know, you had always food, and also you had like a lot of figs that actually spawned because of when the trees were cut, you had like just new species coming in, and a lot of figs basically paradise for primates. So in this case, you can see actually the contrary of a place where the environmental pressure makes you use tools. You can also have the environmental pressure being lifted, and then you use less tools. And what's actually interesting, in still in this very rich environment, when we did field experiments over the course of 10 years, we actually can observe that our chimps tended to use more tools in the periods where the food was lowest, and that they had to produce the largest efforts to access this food. So that really shows you that even if you're in a super rich environment, that little evolutionary pressure that tells you to use tools at particular moment still is there. So to me, that really shows that there is the same things happen both in chimps and humans. So I do think there is, you know, it's good that actually different kind of scientists, whether anthropologists or primatologists or, you know, ecologists, come up with the same conclusions, because that shows a general trend, and you could probably make the same argument also for other more distant species like corvids.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that's very interesting. And you mentioned there at a certain point that there were environments that were changed by humans, and so you were able to study the behavior of different primates in those environments. And Let me ask you. So earlier we talked about experiments done in captivity or in the lab compared to experiments done in natural settings. So we also have to be careful when the environment is changed by humans and the impact that that might have on the behavior of the species that we're studying, right?
So you mean like in the wild, for example? Or,
Yes.
now, I mean, there's always been this kind of let's say, so a lot of people are not necessarily in favor of field experiments because, you know, it's really blurring the boundaries between, you know, usually you do observation in the wild and you do experiment in captivity. But, you know, we are a certain number of researchers who conduct field experiments in the wild with a range of number of species. You know, to me, what's important is that it has to be made very carefully. So at the origin of my PhD, we wanted to see if we could seed a new behavior in a community of chimpanzees, and it was a major failure. You know, the chimps over the last of 3 years and now over the course of 10 years have not developed a new behavior, and at the same time, they developed in parallel a behavior completely naturally. So you know, you never know what you will get, and especially we are not really in their head, so we can only give them the triggers. But if they don't take the triggers, it also tells you that they are very resilient to actually a new innovation or having their behavior being changed by human activities. So you know, this is one point. So field experiments on the one hand, I think, are very controlled, and we're really careful that we're not modifying the behavior of chimpanzees, you know, completely irrationally or anything like that. That's just like natural behavior. And even if a chimp would actually develop stick use in the dongo, you know, if they don't continuously look for honey or things like that, which actually other communities that are really interested in using sticks do, the behavior is not going to stay. So that's the first point. The second point is that naturally humans at the moment are very much impacting most animal communities in the world. And we recently published a study that showed that a number of behaviors are actually already potentially cultural and result from human activities. What I was referring to earlier with these new fruits that the chimps have been feeding on for now 60 years, you know, as a scale of evolutionary times, that's a novel behavior, and that's a behavior that was directly, you know, resulting from humans planting these trees in the first place. So, you know, I think we also have to think that most of the animal species that we are studying by now, when they are habituated to us, there is an impact of humans on them, and it's not only us researchers or the people who follow them. Chimps, for example, do a lot of what we call crop foraging. So they literally go into the village, eat what they can from, you know, sugar canes or other things, and then they go back to the forest. So that gets included in their diet. And this is new behavior that's, again, you know, connected to human activities. So we have to take into account that most of the wild animals we're looking at by now are just wild because they live freely, but they are basically living at the interface with humans.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and from other guests that I had on the show, I heard that human infants over-imitate. That is, while imitating another person performing a particular task, they also imitate gestures or steps that are sort of irrelevant to obtaining whatever they want to obtain while doing that. So, is that really the case? Or...
I mean, overimitation is an interesting phenomenon because, you know, it's something that's real. We observe it, but the question is how, you know, ecologically and evolutionary relevant it is another question. And I was always very skeptical about the conditions. So basically, you're getting like these kids to come to your lab and you tell, oh, you're going to do an experiment, but you have someone demonstrating something super weird in front of you, and then you're like, you know, as a kid, you're like, well, am I supposed to copy that, you know? And, you know, the point is, humans are really like super imitators. This is something nobody would deny, but that's just, you know, the continuation of it. So I had this position, and then I had a student who at the time was a master student in Neuchâtel, and it's called Aurélien Frick, and he told me, well, I want to work on overimitation. So I'm like, ah, cool, we can actually look at it as well. And what he did was really to embed this overimitation task into an innovation task. And we were testing different populations of kids, and you could see that the percentage of overimitation drastically reduces. So instead, most studies are like 80% or 84% or whatever, a very high number of percentage of overimitation, and we just got like 30% of overimitation. And that's interesting because it's both very low number, and especially we had also an important sex effect with girls in that study. Only 10% of girls actually overimitated, while 50% of the boys did. So it tells you there was a lot of variation, but you can still say, well, it's still 30% of the participants who overimitated. So this is something that's really real. And the point is, well, what to make of it. And I think for me, that really shows you that we are a species that's really, really tuned on imitation. We just love to imitate everything. That's our evolutionary strategy. But one thing where I disagree with a lot of researchers is that this is the driver of cumulative culture, because it's been often shown as being the driver of culture. Now that we show that there's culture in other animals that for other people do not imitate, and this is again something that we can debate. The point is like, oh well, now they over-imitate, so this is the driver of cumulative culture. And then you're like, well, but if we copy too much everything, that's a problem. That doesn't help you to innovate. So there is this dual, machine, and you cannot just say, well, imitation is what allowed us to have like super great, super developed cultures, and at the same time, that's also what kept us in an evolutionary stasis for like 1.5 million years, which is what happened with some of our ancestors. So to me, we need to say, well, it's a great boost. That's really the thing what we're using, because it's really easy to acquire information with imitation, but it's still lacking, I think, this cognitive part, whereas you're really like playing with your representations and everything. And this is something completely different. That's connected to imitation, but that's not like the main reason for culture or cumulative culture.
Mm-hmm. You still say that humans are super imitators, and you agree with that. So, in other species, like for example the ones you study, chimps, bonobos, orangutans, and etc., do they also imitate? They imitate less than humans? They imitate in different ways? How does it work exactly?
I think that depends what kind of imitation you're talking about. And, sometimes we are overly critical with other animals. So, it's like if I do something like this and someone else does something with that finger, does it, count as imitation or not? And, it's funny, it's quite amusing because as a reviewer, and, I review for journals in comparative psychology, but also in developmental psychology. And I can see that people have very different ways of saying what is true imitation or not. So, for example, you have like these studies in child development where, what they call imitation would never be called imitation in comparative psychology, because in comparative psychology, people want to be so careful about what is imitation, what is true imitation, and so on, that we just basically say, well, it's not going to be imitation unless it's, they fit all these very, very strong criteria, which I don't see necessarily the same carefulness in developmental psychology. So this is one point. So the question is, depending on people, then you will have different ways of evaluating what's imitation. And, we know that, for example, there are a number of species that are really good at imitation. Look at birds and vocal learning. So this is something that I think still needs a lot of investigation, because if we don't agree, with what is truly imitation, what we agree to be imitation, then it's a bit of, it's an endless debate. If you have a very strong position, well, fine, we will never find imitation in other species, but that doesn't help me to understand how everything evolved in humans. And to me, it looks like it's more interesting to look at, some kinds of particular aspect of observational learning. So I think there is a major difference between me recreating a behavior from scratch because I found a kernel of someone who had been cracking nuts, and me, using my stone like this or like this. I think that's completely irrelevant. So if you want to decide that only if I do like this, that's imitation, I think that's a loss of time. While if you've been, if you have evidence that the individual has been looking and really doing something that's fairly close to what the model was doing, then, that's already imitation. But I think, that's where we scientists come with, it's like we have all ideas about hypotheses. There are things that we defend and others, and, you will tend to be a bit more, asking a bit more of evidence if your whole models, stays on the fact that, other animals don't imitate. So, and to me, I think I'm mostly agnostic with it, because for me, imitation, as I say, I'm never going to deny that we are super great imitators. What I do think is that imitation is just a booster. It's not the defining feature of culture. And when you look at it this way, then, it's less of a problem. So, and all these micro debates do not really, go somewhere to me to explain the finalities, like how cumulative culture evolves.
Mm-hmm. So one final question. You study primates. I mean, we are also primates, of course, but you study other primates and human infants as well. So when you compare them, what are the kinds of things that are more salient? I mean, is it the similarities? Is it the differences? Or what exactly?
I think that's both. When you look at human children in particular, that's amazing how much they try to get information from you and so on. They really look for contact, and the closest you have to that is really an experience with bonobos, because bonobos are just weird among primates. They really want to look deep into your eyes. And it's like, what are you thinking when you want to do that? It's not something you have with chimps and orangutans, or most orangutans I've met at least, and gorillas who I've not been working with, sadly. But, this is this thing. You look at them in the forest, this kind of great setting with all the mothers together, the kids playing together, and you feel like, well, that's really so similar to us. And at the same time, it's so different. And for me, that's this duality that's absolutely fantastic, because to me, I look at chimpanzee, I'm studying chimpanzee because I love chimpanzees, and I'm studying them for their own sake, for their conservation. And at the same time, I also use them in a way to try to understand my own models of human evolution. So it's this duality of, yes, they are so similar, but they are also different. And that's this one thing that strikes you there.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, let me just ask you, so when you compare human infants to other primates, do you get the sense that, for example, at different stages of development, they exhibit a kind of behavior that is similar to other primates, and then as they develop, as they get older, more differences start to accumulate? I mean, can you look back in evolutionary history and find in other animals the different stages of development that human infants go through, for example?
I mean, obviously, I'm not a specialist on that question, but I think the main thing here is that we have this terrible thing that's called language in humans, and that basically changes completely the whole story. So kids between 0 and, let's say, 1.5, 2 years, they might be very similar to chimps, in terms of what they are doing and how they just, interact with some objects and so on. But by that time, they really start to develop language. Then they can ask questions. They will show you something. They will want to know the name for it. And obviously, once you have that, it's just completely different. And, that's why, language is fascinating, because it really assists us in transmitting our cultures. And even like the individual or the building individual that wants to get knowledge will be asking you questions. That's something that chimps or any other animal for that matter will never ask. And one thing I always say to my students is that, well, we might find a lot of properties of human language in animal communication, but no chimp has come up with a with a with a who or whatever vocalization for a stick, you know. So, and this completely changes everything, and that's why, you know, it's not interesting even in a way to look at comparing, because humans are just in a different league as soon as they have language. But that doesn't mean, you know, the original things that were there shared by all species. This common ancestor between humans and chimps and bonobos did not have language the way we do it. They probably had like a system of communication that was quite close to what chimpanzees are using at the moment. You know, that's obviously a guess, but that looks like this. You know, while the bonobo communication system is very much more derived, and it's very weird. You know, when you hear it, you think it's, you know, birds chirping, not like big primates. So the point is, we can look at this kind of big scale developmental things. You know, you can look at it for a lot of things, including the body and everything like that. But the thing is that our brains, at the end of the day, are 3 times as big as the ones of chimps. And a major problem, a major thing that happened when we are really growing up is this language that just hijacks everything, every way, you know, how you feed, how you behave, how you acquire knowledge, everything goes through that single communication system that other animals don't have. So for me, you know, I'm not even asking that question because it doesn't make sense. So what I mean is, you know, when you look at children that are really deprived of all these tools, that's, you know, interesting to see what they can develop. And, you know, all this, everyone knows the famous story of Ellen Keller. And when she finally got it, you know, that water was corresponding to a little tap on her arm or something like that, she just was, you know, going frenzy, just getting everywhere because she wanted names for everything. So we have, even for, you know, children who do not have this ability to ask this information, and everything they have is drive to just put you know, a stamp or a name on anything, and this is something that's just not there in other animals. So to me, that's, you know, I can't even ask the question anymore. It's just a different way of how to acquire knowledge and build your cultural knowledge.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so this is a good point to end our conversation, Dr. Gruber. So just before we go, would you like to mention some of the best places on the internet if people want to find your work?
Well, they can find most. I mean, I'm quite active on Twitter, so usually whenever I'm publishing something, it's there. I also have a website that's absolutely terrible, but you can find all the list of my publication if needed, and they can obviously drop me an email if they want a particular publication that's not accessible on the web. So I think this is the easiest way to get. Just drop me a message on Twitter, you will get the paper very fast.
Okay, great. So I will leave that in the description box of the interview. And Dr. Gruber, thank you a lot again for taking the time to come on the show, and it was a real pleasure to have you on.
Thank you, Ricardo, for this. And if I just might add something that we just didn't talk about, one thing that's also very important to working with wild animals is that we all work on their conservation. So what's extremely important to us is not only, you know, studying their behavior, but also contributing to preserving some populations and some species. And this is a massive part of the work that's, I think, is, you know, societal and something that, you know, we want to keep having chimps in the wild for the next generation to understand things, because right now chimps and other species like orangutans are very much threatened. So to me, it's very important every time I give this kind of discussions or things like that to really mention that this is really wonderful to work with these apes, but it's also something that's very, very threatened at the moment. You can see with, you know, COVID and all these things that actually are also transmissible to the apes. So to me, it's important to just mention that we learn a lot from them, but we also owe them that we need to protect them as well, so that we can keep on studying them in the wild.
Hello everybody, thank you for watching this interview until the end. As you might have noticed, I've started this channel back in February 2018 and have been putting out regular interviews with academics and intellectuals from a variety of fields. And to keep the channel sustainable, I would like to ask you to please visit my Patreon page and to consider making a pledge there. And I also have links to PayPal in the description box of the interview. Otherwise, and if you like what I'm doing, please share it, leave a like and hit the subscription button. I would also like to give a huge thank you to my patrons and main supporters, Karen Litska and Blanchett, Peruga Larsen, Lau Guerrero, Francis Ford, Hans Frederick Sunda, Ricardo Vladimiro, Greg Healy, Adam Castle, Olaf Alex, Jonathan Wiesel, David Diaz, Anian Kata, Jacob Klinkby, Matthew Whittingbird, Arno Wolf, Tim Hollacy, Enric Alenius, John Connors, Paulina Barron, Philip Force Connolly, Jerry Mueller, Herbert Gintis, Rutger Voss, Bo Weingard, Rebecca Newberger Goldstein, Dan Demetri, Robert Windiger, Rui Inácio, Arthur Coe, Marco Neves, Max Bailby, Colin Holbrook, Susan Pinker, Thomas Trumbull, Bernardo Seixas, Pablo Santurbano, Simon Columbus, Jorge Espinha, Phil Kavanagh, Corey Clark, Mark Blythe, Roberto Inguanzo, Michael Stormir, Eric Neumann, Samuel Andreev, Tiago Nunes, Bernard Hugney, Alexander Dunbauer, Omari Hickson, Felicia Stevens, Fergal Cusson, Evan Bodrenko, Hal Herzog, Nuno Machado, Don Ross, João Alves da Silva, Jonathan Leibrant, Oslam Bullet, Nathan Nguyen, Stanton T, Samuel Correa, Eric Hines, Mark Smith, J.W., João Eira, Tom Hummel, Sardus France, David Sloan Wilson, and Yacila Deza Araújo. My producers is Weber, Jim Frank, Lucas Stafiniak, Dr. Ian Gilligan, Sergio Quadriano, Luís Caetano, Matthew Lavender, Tom Vanagdam, Curtis Dixon, João Linhares, Benedict Mueller, Vega Gidi, and my executive producers, Michel Rugieski, Rosie, and James Pratt. Thank you for all.